Hello and welcome. Today is Thursday, May 7th, and it would be an A day if we were still in school. For today's video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about plot, which has kind of been the theme for this week. We've already mentioned the 5 elements of plot. We've talked about conflict when I was playing with Legos, and unfortunately, I play with them again today. But for this, I'm going to talk about the 7 fundamental types of plot. There are actually lots of different types of plot, but I'm going to go over the 7 kind of primary types of plot that you see most often. They're kind of like the archetypes of plot, which is a whole separate topic for a video we'll probably cover next week, but let's just dive right into it. So what is plot? Plot is the sequence of events, typically involving conflict, that make up the basis of a story, right? So that's plot in a nutshell. It's just how the events go along in a story. Nothing more than that. So in stories, they typically follow a couple of set routines, right? We've been alive for a while, right? Humans have been on this earth for thousands of years. Storytelling has been a primary component of human interaction and civilization. It's how information was passed from generation to generation. It is how we actually organized as civilizations. We told stories. In many early civilizations, the most important person in a village was the storyteller. So stories became very important. And because of our background as a species with telling stories, we started to tell stories that were very similar. And if you ever study literature, eventually what you start to notice is there are a lot of patterns that exist throughout, right? You see very similar things, and it doesn't matter where in the world you're talking about. You can read stories from India and looking back at the culture of Hindi and so forth that have a lot of similarities to stories originating in the areas around Jerusalem and so forth. So stories are a big part of our species and culture in general for humans. And because of all of that, we have some basic commonalities with plot. And that's where this idea of types of plot comes from. So let's go down and start naming them. So our first type of plot, our basic type of plot, is the overcoming the monster, right? So this should be pretty straightforward. In this style of plot, our protagonist or group of protagonists have to overcome some sort of overwhelming evil force. It can be one physical monster, or it can be some, abstract feeling of evil. Think of like movies like Star Wars with overcoming the dark side and, things like that. In the most recent movies with, the Avengers and overcoming the Outriders in their quest to stop Thanos and his Infinity Gauntlet. So Captain America and the heroes. They have to overcome that monster, that evil, Thanos and other villains, Ultron, and depending how far back you go. So that overcoming the monster, very common theme you see, particularly in older literature because of the idea of not a lot of knowledge of the world, a lot of things being attributed to otherworldly creatures and monsters. So overcome the monster, very common one. The knight slaying the dragon. Right? Very common in fables and so forth. Number 2, rags to riches. Again, another very popular idea for a story, partly because it inspires a lot of hope for people, right? It's a great way to make people feel like anything is possible. To hear stories wherein the protagonist starts off with nothing and then through the course of the story ends up with a lot of something, right? Ends up with great wealth. So think of things like Cinderella. Cinderella starts off with a horrible life situation and then ends up, with the prince and so forth. Now, there's some other issues to address with that story, but we're going to move on past that. Aladdin, right? Starts off as a street rat, and then by the end of the story, marries Jasmine and so forth. So again, that idea of starting off poor and then gaining wealth and riches. Rags to riches, it's one of those basic ones. 3, the quest. Again, another very popular type of plot wherein the protagonist has to go on a quest to do something or retrieve something. A lot of times people who study film will refer to this as the MacGuffin, so that's something if you want to look into. I think even Teen Titans Go did a whole episode about MacGuffins, which was pretty interesting. You can probably search on YouTube for that. But it's this idea that the characters have to go on a quest to obtain something. Lord of the Rings, a very popular one would be, An obvious example of that, Indiana Jones from my childhood was a very big one for that too. Number 4, the voyage. Going someplace and then return, right? Having to go to a place and come back from it. That is, again, another common plot type that you see pretty frequently. Going someplace dangerous and coming back, or going to another side and coming back. Think of like the Odyssey, right? The famous Greek epic poem. Lord of the Rings, again, kind of falls into that category. The Chronicles of Narnia and so forth, with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, all fall into that category of voyage and return. Now we go into 5, the comedy. Right? And this one's pretty straightforward. It involves something good, and in the traditional form of a comedy always had the happy ending. That was a big primary component of it. Nowadays we think of something having a lot of humor to it, and that's obviously pretty straightforward. A lot of children's books that are becoming pretty popular now, like Captain Underpants and so forth, in terms of graphic novels, which I talked about earlier. Those are pretty common for comedy and whatnot. Number 6 would be tragedy, the opposite of comedy, right? So tragedy has some sort of bad ending for the protagonist. Something befalls them and they end up suffering at the end. It does not end in a pleasant way for the main character. So tragedies are that type. Now, you'll see that particularly in media, tragedies and movies and so forth don't tend to be used a lot because audiences don't like that, right? Audiences want to see their main characters be successful and be happy. So that's one that you don't typically see a lot of in movies and TV, but in literature, you will come across that a lot with that bad ending for that character, which leads us to the last one for number 7. Got Legos in my hand, so it's hard to do, is the rebirth. And rebirth is important because it takes a protagonist who is typically considered a villain, a bad person, and throughout the course of the story, something happens to change them. They become reborn by the end of the story. The events of the plot causes that character to rethink their lives and change them, right? So Christmas Carol with Ebenezer Scrooge starts off being a very horrible individual, then over the course of the story has a change of heart and is good. And then very similar to A Christmas Carol, of course, is the Grinch, right? Throughout the story of the Grinch, he changes and his heart grows 3 sizes too big and so forth and becomes good by the end of the story. So very classic examples of the rebirth. And that's it. So 7 types of plot, base plots. There are a lot of different variations of that. I'm sure if you went online, you could find all kinds of different tropes and variations that deviate just slightly from that. You could probably find 1,000 different plot types that are just basic changes to those 7. But for the most part, that's what you can kind of wheedle everything down into. So that's it, 7 types of plot. Hope everyone's well. You can kind of see Loco right there, not happy that he's locked out. I have to lock him out now because he's got this really horrible habit of knocking the tripod onto my face. 2 days ago, he nailed me pretty hard in the temple with the tripod while I was on my computer, which was not very fun. And he also likes to chew on Voltron's sword there, which is a little aggravating too, but whatever. Hope everyone's well. If you have a question or comment, please, leave it below the video or email me. And until next time, I hope everyone's well. Be good.